Senator Libous.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I've just handed up a privileged resolution at the desk, and I ask that it be read in its entirety and this body move to adopt it.
Secretary will read.
By Senators Libous, Montserrat, and Maziarz, providing for the election of Pedro Espada, Jr. as temporary president of the Senate, and Dean G. Skelos as
It was that seemingly innocuous exchange that kicked off the Senate coup 10 years ago. But as the familiar voice of the Senate Journal clerk continued reading, and the secret plotting of the Senate Republicans dawned on the assembled crowd in the chamber, a parliamentarian kerfuffle emerged, with Senator Jeff Kline, a Bronx Democrat, trying his best to close the barn door after the proverbial horse had already left.
Majority Leader.
I move that we stand at ease.
Excuse me, Mr. President. I believe I have the floor, and the Senate cannot stand at ease at this point in time.
Senate will stand at ease.
Ask for immediate vote.
Immediate vote on the motion to stand at ease, Mr. President.
By show of hands.
By show of hands, an immediate vote. I have the floor, and you cannot stand at ease.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is the Capitol Confidential podcast, Tales from the Coup. Our fourth installment of the series revolves solely around the day Senate Republicans, with the help of two wayward Democrats, implemented their plan to take back the chamber they had controlled for decades. We'll explore the process that played out on the floor and learn what the day was like for the politicians, reporters, and Albany insiders who survived it.
I don't care if I'm the only one standing, but someone has got to stand up and say that this is wrong.
Tom Libous was masterful on the floor of the Senate.
Employees of the Senate that did not get changed out, that, grew up with the Republicans, came up with the Republicans, and we're still feeding information to the Republicans. I mean, I think that's a pretty non-controversial statement.
The Senate Democrats are still in the majority. Senator Malcolm Smith is still the majority leader, pro tem. We understand that there was a vote taken on the floor after the session was gavelled out.
Eventually, Jeff adjourned, and we all marched out and directly into the conference room, where it was basically pandemonium.
June 8th, 2009 was supposed to be business as usual, remembers Austin Shaffron, then the spokesman for the Senate Democrats.
It was getting toward the final weeks of the session, so there were a lot of major legislative priorities that the conference was looking forward to moving on. There was, obviously issues over education reform and control of New York City schools. There was tenant rent law protection. There was, the potential still at that point to see if the marriage equality legislation would be able to at least be brought up for an initial vote, even if there weren't enough votes to secure it. And I don't think until you actually heard the call from the rostrum that anyone understood what was going on. And even while it was happening, because it was so unique, because it was so unprecedented, a lot of people were caught off guard.
Senator Diane Savino, a Staten Island Democrat, who was in the process of overseeing the 3 days of festivities organized by the Conference of Italian-American Legislators, remembers having a million different things going on at the time. But she said Democratic lawmakers were looking forward to signing off on $85 million in pork projects.
The only thing that we had to do that day, besides, the festa, which was no big deal, other than to me, was we had a resolution that was supposed to be voted on our member items in the capital budget.
But it was that vote specifically that played into the timing of the coup, according to Rich Azzopardi, then a spokesman for Senator Craig Johnson, a Long Island Democrat.
At the time, the legislature still had member items. And the member items, Malcolm put a lump sum in, but he did not assign them out. That was going to be done via resolution in June. That was a way Malcolm was going to try to keep his members, from going off the reservation on any number of issues. That day was the day the resolution was going to be voted on. And Pedro was trying to redirect his member items to two relatively new nonprofits that the Senate believed he controlled. They said no to Pedro, and Pedro took his ball and went to the other side of the aisle.
And while the coup would eventually catch the chamber by surprise, the Times-Union reported that Senator George Maziarz, a Niagara County Republican at the center of the power grab, headed to the Capitol that day, worried that Senate Democrats had caught wind of the plan. The week before, while the GOP had been plotting, Angelo Aponte, the top aide to Senate Majority Leader Malcolm Smith, had requested a Monday morning meeting with Maziarz. But the meeting was just about chamber decorum, and the two men shook hands without the secret spilling. Maziarz told the Times-Union, quote, "I knew we were going to catch him off guard." This optimism wasn't necessarily shared by Senator George Winter, a Southern-tier Republican who had tried and failed in the Assembly to sneak through procedural maneuvers.
I mean, I've been through, sort of trying surreptitious guerrilla warfare before, and it rarely works.
So in order for the Senate Republicans' maneuver to work, they would need a little help on the inside to pull off the plan they had been rehearsing over the weekend, which we covered in episode 3 of this series. They found that help in large part from central staffers who had worked for the Republican majority and had either been kept around by the new Democratic majority or simply hadn't been replaced yet. Jim Odato, then a reporter with the Times-Union, said there were behind-the-scenes employees who might have been in a position to sound the alarm when the paperwork that would unseat Malcolm Smith began making its way through official back channels.
There are officials on the field who, depending on whether they saw something unusual, could have thrown a yellow flag or a flare or done something. But those functionaries, because of the time, were wedded to the Republicans. They were used to working with the Republicans. And they had, for many years, worked for an operation that was, I wouldn't say it was well-oiled, but it was definitely oiled. And some of those functionaries, when they saw the resolution or the proposal that was put forward by Tom Libous, perhaps if they were working for their prior bosses, they might have raised an eyebrow and said, hey, you ought to take a look at this. But they didn't. They let the process roll out. And these are people that were working in the chamber when this all came down. So they say, okay, let's let this happen. And they let what unfolded happen. And it was interesting because some of these people it was rumored that some of these people were going to be let go in the near future by the Democrats, who were beginning to change out the Republican staff with Democratic staff, but they hadn't quite finished doing all this.
But there was also a critical ace in the hole, according to Jack Casey, who had served as the parliamentarian under the Republicans and had been choreographing their power grab over the weekend.
Few people realize, but the guy that was reading there, the Secretary of the State Senate, was a guy named Tom Testo. Tom Testo and I went through 4 years of high school together, and we were boyhood friends and really, really close. The Testos in Troy are a very big family, and I rented from one of his second cousins for a year. So it was kind of a sort of blood brother relationship I had with Tom, and he was the guy that read. Well, after we lost the majority, they kept Tom on, so I had an in. The critical point of this entire coup was getting the resolution read in open session. So it was critical for me to get Tom on the desk that day and bring it up to him so that he would read it, and then you could not get it off. You had to dispose of it one way or another. You'd have to pull it, you'd have to vote on it, you'd have to send it to a committee. There's only certain things you can do once it's on the floor. So that was the critical moment in this whole crazy scenario that we had going, that we had to get that thing read. So I couldn't talk to anybody, and as you say, it was secret, and we kept it confidential, attorney-client privilege and all of that. So 15 minutes before session on that Monday, which was June 8th, 2009, I took Tommy Testo aside and I said, we're taking it back. And he said, what? I said, we're taking the majority back. He said, how are you going to do that? I said, I'm bringing a resolution up to you. Read it and just stand there and be strong and get it on the floor. And he said, can I see it? And I said, nobody sees this until you read it.
There was a fear, though, that Tom Testo might not be reading resolutions that day.
Andrea Stewart Cousins had a designee that she was trying to break in as the secretary, as the person that read on the floor that day. And in my humble opinion, if she had been on the desk that day, this whole thing never would have happened. But because Tom was there And there was a level of trust that was very high. Johnny Callow used to sit next to Bruno. We were all in high school together. So we had this triumvirate going on. The three of us knew each other in high school. We were all good friends. So we ran the floor very smoothly under Senator Bruno for years. And so Tom was still there, and I gave him the resolution, and he read it, and hallelujah.
Senate Democrats reject the notion that Testo had any forewarning, and he would deny it as well. For whatever reason, though, when Senator Neil Breslin directed him to read the notorious resolution, he did it, and the coup had begun. If the plan had been sniffed out or blocked on the floor, John McArdle, then the Senate Republican spokesman, said they had nothing to lose, and it was full steam ahead.
Really not sure what the plan B was, since I think they were all in at that point, and I think the feeling was it couldn't get much worse than it was at that point.
As it began to unfold, the action was captured from the viewing gallery by NY1 reporter Aaron Billups, who covered the Capitol at the time and was the first journalist present, according to Senate Republicans.
I think I had pretty much wrapped up or thought I knew what I would be covering that day. And, I think Scott, he approached me in the hallway. I happened to have my camera and tripod on me. And he's like, you might want to go into the Senate chamber right now, or in a few minutes. And he wouldn't tell me exactly why, but he made it sound like it would be worth my while. So I grabbed a few more pieces of gear, and I went upstairs. And I don't know if it's the same now, but the inputs for the cameras so that you could get good audio were on, if you're facing the podium, were on the left side gallery, but I couldn't get in that door for some reason. So I had to go around to the other side, and I set up on the side that I don't normally set up on, and the inputs there aren't as reliable. So I had my camera set up, and I remember I couldn't get audio, which I was very frustrated about. But I still had visually the scene that was happening.
Karen DeWitt, a public radio correspondent, said she was walking up to the Capitol when she got a notification on her BlackBerry that something was up. Senate Republican spokesman John McArdle says they didn't initially tip their hands to the media.
We didn't tell them why, but we told them that they would want to be in the chamber. And we also made sure that we had some people in there that we knew, and they asked to be there to provide a feed in the event there were no TV cameras. So we'd sort of taken a lot of precautions to make sure that what we did anticipate was the feed being shut off, that we were prepared.
Richard Azzopardi was chatting with members of the Daily News Bureau when GOP spokesman Scott Reif came into the Capitol office that houses most of the day-to-day reporters.
Scott Reif comes in, and he's like, everyone get to the floor. There's stuff going on. Everyone get to the floor. Get to the floor. Now, Scott's a friend of mine. I've known him for years. Not so much back then, but he looked at me and he goes, you definitely should get to the floor. And then I get to the floor, and like you can hear a pin drop, and everyone's confused.
Anyone familiar with a normal day in the Senate could have noticed early on during session that day that something was wrong. While lawmakers normally arrive late and float around the chamber, Senator George Winter, a Southern Tier Republican, said that wasn't the case for him or his Republican colleagues that day.
First of all, I was flabbergasted that no one could pick up on the body language. I mean, you walked into the chamber that morning, you had 30 Republican senators all sitting in their seats like, obedient Catholic school children. I mean, this is like unheard of. So, the fact that no one picked up on it, or the fact that no one blabbed over the weekend or whatever, and we walked in there and did that, I was just, overwhelmed.
Senator Liz Krueger, a Manhattan Democrat, says the assembled audience in the chamber and galleries should have roused some suspicions.
Well, in retrospect, I should have thought it was funny that there were so many people around and press around, but I confess I was totally oblivious that something was about to blow up until I'm sitting on the floor.
The packed house included Tom Golisano, a well-known Rochester billionaire who was secretly helping foster the defection of two Democrats. Senator Neil Breslin, a Bethlehem Democrat who was presiding over the chamber from the dais, never noticed the notorious figure.
If I had noticed him in the gallery, I don't think other than to say, gee, that's Tom Golisano up there, I would have thought any differently.
The process on the floor began with action on a privileged resolution, which Republican staffer Jack Casey describes as a special resolution.
Well, this is a separate category. It's called a privileged resolution. Privileged resolutions don't have to go through the vetting process. They don't have to go through committee. A lot of them, with the resolutions honoring different people, would go through the finance committee generally. But privileged resolutions are just brought in and brought up to the desk. So that's what this was. So privileged resolutions, there's a zillion of them. Nobody knows what they are. This was a very unique resolution. This was a change in leadership.
One copy was handed over to the Democratic counsel advising Jeff Klein, the deputy majority leader, who was responsible for directing the action on the floor, and Casey brought a copy to the dais, where Neil Breslin held the gavel. This was a pivotal moment for the Senate Democrats, recalls Rich Azzopardi.
If anybody bothered to look at that piece of paper before Tom said something, this could have been avoided. And Tom had more power than he thought.
But Senator George Maziarz, a Niagara County Republican, wasn't surprised by what happened, because when he presided over the chamber the year before, he always let resolutions be read without looking at them. And just as they planned, Breslin directed the Senate Journal clerk, Tom Testo, to read the resolution, which called for Dean Skelos to become majority leader and made Pedro Espada the temporary president of the Senate. GOP staffer Jack Casey, who was sitting next to Tom Libous, the Republican floor leader, said it was like a bomb went off in the chamber.
We had conference beforehand, and Senator Skelos was then the minority leader, and he made it very clear that all these members had to stay in the chamber while this whole thing was going on.
Republican Senator George Winter said the events couldn't have unfolded any better.
The fact that, that they actually read that privilege resolution, that just was ridiculous. But they did. It's not Breslin's fault. He's up there in the dais. He's not a trained he's not a lawyer, or he is a lawyer, but he's not a trained parliamentarian type guy and whatever. And he's up there, relying on counsels, to help out and whatever. And the idea that the clerk ended up reading that thing is amazing. So anyway. The whole thing worked. It worked amazingly. Mechanically, the thing worked amazingly well.
As it became clear what was happening, Senate staffers began wrangling Democrats who weren't in the chamber, including Senator Dan Squadron, a freshman member from Manhattan, who would be in the middle of the action as it unfolded.
Being fairly unpopular with the folks as a reformer and an outsider, I had been given the seat next to Pedro. So I had Pedro on one side, and actually someone who I really ended up being quite friendly with, and learned a lot from, Bill Perkins on the other. But Pedro was on one side of me, and then I went to his right. Having never threatened to weaken the conference, that was still the seat I was given. And a staff member came out and sort of snarled, "Get on the floor," to me and to a bunch of other people, about as intensely as ever happened. So I ran into the floor, kind of knowing something was up. I sat down, and Pedro was all right. So Pedro always sat as if he was on camera. So he had monogrammed cuffs and fancy cufflinks, with his initials. And he would sit with his hands clasped on his desk, with straight posture, but leaning slightly forward, and sort of a mild smile on his face. Ready for the cameras throughout session. And he was in his customary position there, but I could see that his hands clasped together were shaking a little bit. And so I turned to him when I said, "Pedro, what's happening?" And he said nothing. I said again, not reading his cue, "What's going on?" And he without moving his face at all, he said, "Nothing. And so then I turned to Perkins, who I guess was just coming to a seat, and I said, "What's going on?" And then sort of the parliamentary patois between Libous and Klein and Breslin was sort of at that point in full swing. And it became very clear very quickly what had happened.
Watching the mechanics of the coup unfold on the floor, Squadron said that Senator Tom Libous, quote, commanded that moment.
That Libous performance is really an extraordinary thing. With just the way that he commanded, the way that he maintained command of the floor.
Senator Jeff Kline tried to halt the process by calling for a temporary break in session, which Senator Tom Libous, who was known as Rambo, moved to oppose.
And Majority Leader.
I move that we stand at ease.
Excuse me, Mr. President. I believe I have the floor, and the Senate cannot stand at ease at this point in time.
Senate will stand at ease.
Ask for immediate vote.
Immediate vote on the motion to stand at ease, Mr. President.
By show of hands.
By show of hands, an immediate vote. I have the floor, and you cannot stand at ease.
In the background, you can hear a Republican counsel reminding Libous to call for a vote, which Senator George Winter said was part of the plan for whatever happened.
The bottom line is all we told Libous is no matter what they do, just say roll call, because now we got 32 votes. Everything that they want to do, you can overturn by having a roll call.
After conferring privately with Democratic attorneys, Breslin declared the motion out of order. This was immediately appealed by Libous because he knew he had the votes to overturn the decision. With a show of hands on the appeal, Hiram Montserrat and Pedro Espada were exposed as the defectors because they stood up from their seats in the Democratic conference and raised their hands to side with the senators who were literally and figuratively across the aisle. Here's how it played out.
Secretary will read the results.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Ayes 32, nays 30.
Wait a minute. Should be quiet.
I have the floor, Mr.
President, I move we adjourn.
The resolution is pending. Immediate vote on adjournment. The resolution is pending. This is good. Roll call! Roll call on the
With the
vote.
bang of the gavel, Neil Breslin walked off the dais, and Senate Democrats began filing out of the chamber. Republican staffer Jack Casey remembers a few Democratic senators sticking around to see what would happen next.
And it was pretty chaotic. And so Senator Libous sent George Winter up to the desk, and I went up with him to be his parliamentarian. So it was like taking the hill at Iwo Jima. I mean, it was really wild. And we went up there, and the whole place was really in mayhem.
Senator George Winter said this was all according to their plan.
They attempted to adjourn. I anticipated that. So as soon as I ascended to the chair, I just said there's a motion on the floor to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye, and all those opposed signify by saying no. We had the votes to not adjourn, so the Senate was still in session. They shut the lights off, shortly thereafter. But meanwhile, we swore in the new majority leader. We had some other rules changes or whatever that we offered up, but and so we passed those things, but we didn't, we didn't really have a clerk, so we didn't have any way to really to log them in.
Senate Democratic spokesman Austin Shafran says he wasn't the one who turned off the lights.
It could have been anyone from the office of the operations office, from the Secretary of the Senate. I think that there was so much chaos and so much confusion. Nobody knew who was running the ship. I mean, it was the Titanic in Albany.
As it all went down, NY1 reporter Aaron Billups kept on filming.
Neil Breslin was on the podium at that time and had no idea what was going on. I looked at some of my old footage, and there's a moment where he actually looks straight up into my camera, and the look on his face is like, I have no idea what's happening right now. It was a pretty insane moment. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of huddling of the Democrats. I remember at one point they turned off the mics, they turned off the lights. There have been reports that they shut off the Senate camera feed that was, like the public access feed that would go out during session. After I realized or started to piece together what was happening, I was immediately on the phone, hiding in between the rows in the gallery upstairs, trying to reach out to my producers. And I did some, live phone conversations about it, I remember.
Blair Horner, a good government advocate, got to experience everything with Tom Golisano, even though it wasn't obvious to him at the time that he was one of the schemers.
It was serendipitous in retrospect. I was in the Senate lobby. Don't remember who I was talking to. I was there on a bill, and I saw one of the former counsels to Senator Bruno come wandering in, somebody who I know reasonably well, and I was surprised to see him. I think he'd been over at the Legislative Ethics Committee at the time. And I said to him, "So what are you doing here?" And he just smiled and said, "I have some work for a client." And I thought I was sort of puzzled by that. Then I heard that something was going to be happening on the floor. So as I headed upstairs, I bumped into Tom Golisano, who was also going into the Senate chamber. And he said, "Come with me, you're going to like this." So I'm still sort of amazed by what was happening. And I walk in, I'm sitting with Tom in the Senate gallery. And then I got a chance to watch the antics on the floor where the Senate minority at the time, led by Senator Libous, led a floor fight to take over the chamber. And it was, complete chaos. People were arguing over what the rules were. Senator Breslin was at the time at the podium. As far as I could tell, the Democrats were caught completely flat-footed.
Despite the disarray, Senate GOP spokesman John McCardle said his side remained focused on their mission.
Well, we had obviously some counsels and parliamentarians who worked for the Senate minority at the time, who understood how the floor worked and what resolutions and procedures would be necessary to do what was contemplated. So I think they were very well prepared on that front.
Times Union reporter Jim Odato said the staff for the Senate Democrats were not equally prepared for the moment, noting at the time that their top lawyer was a seasoned legal operative, but not a, quote, wartime consigliere.
He was a lawyer. He was a damn good lawyer. But what was going on right here was a little bit of a battle scene, and it was a blitzkrieg, but nobody really saw it coming because the guys who the Democrats had in their corner doing the legal work, like I said, they were damn good policy guys. They were guys who understood legislation and policy, and they were bright lawyers, but they were not the sharp-edged, battle-tested, political-oriented lawyers that the Republicans had in force for so long. These guys were good in many kinds of fights: legislative fights, policy fights, and political fights.
Senator Neil Breslin, who was overseeing the chamber at the time, didn't blame the staffers for what happened on the floor.
I don't have any blame for any of the people involved. My blame is directed at Hiram Montserrat and Pedro Espada. We didn't expect after the Four Amigos to have any problems with any of our members, and it quite frankly caught us by surprise.
In the immediate aftermath, Breslin told the Times-Union that he had been worried about doing anything illegal.
I remember Pedro Espada and Hiram Montserrat standing up and indicating they were not on our team anymore, and that meant we went from a one-seat majority to a one-seat minority. And the parliamentarian, I asked if he had any suggestions. He said adjourn. So I slammed the gavel and adjourned.
He also faulted Senate Republicans for bringing the resolution without the approval of the majority, saying, quote, "I have always assumed that people in the chamber are honorable." At the time, Senator Tom Libous told the Times-Union that he thought Breslin might have thrown a wrench in their plans. Quote, "I'm an observer," he said. "I see who's good on the floor. I thought Breslin would have been tougher." Here's how Senator Diane Savino remembers the proceeding.
And Neil didn't know what to do. He kind of was just stunned, what do I do? And it's like they teach you when you handle the rostrum, you look at the floor leader. You pay attention to only the floor leader. Doesn't matter what anybody else says. It's the floor leader. So, again, it's like a startling moment.
Senator Liz Krueger, a Manhattan Democrat, is more forgiving about what happened.
There's absolutely zero time to think it through and walk through what should one do immediately.
On the way out of the chamber, Senator Diane Savino said the ramifications hadn't sunk in for all of her colleagues.
We adjourned and we're all leaving. And I remember Shirley Huntley was standing next to me and she goes, what is happening? What is happening here? I said, "Shirley, we are being overthrown." And she said, What are you talking about? I said, Hiram and Espada are or like joining the Republicans. And she goes, what's going on? I said, apparently they're really pissed off at Malcolm. She goes, well, I'm pissed off at him too. And I said, Shirley, we are being overthrown. Like, shut up and follow me. It's like they had no idea what was happening.
As lawmakers shuffled out, Rich as a party recalls a comment from two allies of the defectors, Senators Carl Kruger and Ruben Diaz, who had been part of the pre-session extortion with Pedro Espada that we covered in episode 1.
On the day of the vote, where the two came over, Carl and Diaz were like, "What are you doing? Why didn't you tell us about this? We could have done something." I swear I heard them say that to him. And and Pedro and Hiram both standing there, standing there with like his hands up, just like looking stone faced at him. And it was like a surreal. It was to add to the surrealness of it.
Senator Craig Johnson, a Long Island Democrat, said during their private Democratic conference after session, a new fear popped up for all the shell-shocked senators.
As I recall, there was a concern that they would try to bring us back, that they would, by they being the Republicans and Espada and Montserrat, and try to drag us in by getting like the sergeant at arms to come in and get us and call us out. So we actually scattered, and I left the state. I drove like any good Long Islander. I went shopping. I went to the outlet malls. Once a outlet mall shopper, always an outlet mall shopper. I went over to Lee, Massachusetts, thinking in my head, there's no way they can come over the border and get me. And I basically went outlet shopping. I think it was me, Savino, I think Diane, and I think Bill Stokowski went over there. And I started looking at suits at the Brooks Brothers outlet. I think I went into the Lindt chocolate shop. And I stayed over in Massachusetts for a couple hours. I wanted to let the dust settle. And I think a couple hours later, I can't remember who called me, but somebody said, come on back.
Another response by the Senate Democrats was to enlist the help of Michael Nieves with the hope that he might be able to bring the wayward Democrats back into the fold.
Later on in the evening, I get a phone call by members saying they need someone who can communicate to both Hiram and Pedro. And since I had a working relationship with both of them when they were members of the city council, Pedro first and then Hiram later, they thought it would be easier for someone who had a relationship to deal with them. So I got in my car and drove up. When I get onto the scene, I meet with Malcolm and his people to hear their side of the story before I meet with Hiram and Pedro, because I wanted to make sure I understood what was going on. And that's how my involvement started.
When the Senate Republicans finished their session, they took questions outside the chamber and explained their side of what just happened. Dean Skelos, a Long Island Republican who had taken over leadership of the conference the year before, thanked Tom Golisano and proclaimed the coup the, quote, right thing to do.
We're going to do good work for the people of the state of New York. We are going to work hard to make this coalition government work. All right, that's our challenge now, to make it work. And I believe we can absolutely make it work. And as the members see themselves empowered, they're going to understand that this is the right way to go.
Senator Pedro Espada, the new temporary president of the Senate, proclaimed the new majority would be bipartisan and bilingual.
I want to thank my colleagues in the Republican conference. I want to thank Tom Golisano. I want to thank my assembly colleagues, particularly those in the Hispanic conference, among them the most senior members of the assembly for so many years that have guided me and imparted their wisdom. But at the end of the day, what you witnessed today may be characterized as a power grab, as a coup. Please understand, this is a new beginning for New York State, a new beginning of bipartisan government, a new beginning of real reform. We experienced 5 months of failure, a budget process that was dealt out in secrecy, punishing members to vote a certain way. The 30 Republicans asked many times, Are there some brave citizens and senators on the other side of the aisle? And we did respond today. Now it's a time to lead with coalition, with consensus, and that I am assured will happen. It's in the Senate rules that we have the need and the of consensus by the Republicans, by the an expanding Democratic reform coalition, and I think that's what the citizens of the state need.
Those rules mentioned by Espada were billed as the rationale for the power grab, as the new coalition tried to say their focus was on making the chamber more democratic, a process the Democratic majority had failed to deliver. Rich, as a party, tipped his hat to the Republicans for their framing of the coup.
Cynical and brilliant branding. Pedro Espada, Dean Skelos, Hiram Montserrat called themselves the Reform Coalition. And it was because over the last year, their entire argument was the Senate Democrats said they'd reform, they'd pass ethics reform, they'd change the rules, they'd do campaign finance reform, they would equalize stuff in the chambers, they would make allocations equal, and they didn't do any of it. Now, a lot of it, there is a lot of validity to that argument. However, they were just getting their feet under them. The old Senate Democratic majority was so off kilter from the very beginning. Just getting through a day and passing bills was a feat.
News of the coup took a little bit longer to reach Governor David Paterson, according to his former spokesman, Morgan Hook.
We were in Syracuse, and he had done an event earlier in the day, and we followed up that event with a private meeting. I think he was meeting with faith leaders, and we were at some restaurant in the outskirts of Syracuse. And this is before the age of Twitter, right? So we're not getting like real-time updates from the LCA as we're standing in Syracuse. I think people are sending us emails of like Liz Benjamin's blog update, and we're reading this. And so the governor is over having this meeting, and I'm with his body man and maybe some other staff, and we're all getting these updates. And it's kind of like, we should probably tell the governor what's going on here. So we find a pause in the meeting, and we brought him over privately, and we read him these blog reports and told him what was going on. And when his body man kind of said, "Governor, I think we got to go. We got to get back to Albany right now." And the governor kind of said, "No, I'm here. I'm doing a meeting, and I'm going to finish that meeting, and then we can go like on our regular scheduled time." And I could be wrong about this, but I kind of felt like the governor maybe didn't know that the coup was going to happen, but he sure seemed not surprised by what we were telling him. And my memory could be faulty because it was a while ago, but I could almost remember him saying something like, "Oh, they did it, huh?" I could be totally making that up, but my memory kind of has him saying like, "Well, I guess they did it." So you kind of get the sense that he was aware that there were some really unhappy campers in the Democratic conference.
Paterson denies having any knowledge of the plans, and after arriving at the Capitol, he held a media availability where he was visibly pissed.
The actions taken on the Senate floor today need to be exposed for what they are: an unnecessary distraction to government dressed up in the cloak, falsely, of reform and good government. I should be standing here right now talking to you about the issues that the people need Albany to address. But once again, Albany's dysfunction has raised its ugly head. This is an outrage. And I think when the real reformers know that their name is being used for these types of actions, they will be as incensed as I am. This is a government. Our country was founded on the basis of individualism, where people were encouraged to have beliefs, to have dialogue, and to fight their problems out in public. In January, they elected the leadership in the Senate, and those individuals committed to support that person for 2 years. What happened to the handshake? What happened to somebody's word? What happened to the integrity that we all believe that we are advocating when we take our oath of office? Now, every week, just because the Senate is close between the two major parties and someone doesn't like something that's going on, we change leadership, or are we really changing leadership? Aren't we changing power? This is despicable what happened here today.
When the dust settled that evening, Rich as a party said all sides retreated to their corners.
And that night, like every lobbyist went back to their old friends. Like everyone thought it was a fait accompli that day, that there was no road back. And that night, every bar in Albany was hopping with staffers and lobbyists and people celebrating. And myself and a bunch of the Senate Democratic staffers, we went to the Palais Royale because we knew that was the one place we would never see them, and we basically drank all the beer.
10 years later, former Times Union reporter Jim Odato says the coup was a remarkable feat.
You almost had to take your hat off to them because it's tough to do. What they did was perfectly timed, and the time was right for them to try it. And if they had not been successful, it wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world. I mean, it would have been, okay, we tried it. You take your football and you go home and you say, okay, we gave it a shot. It was almost a Hail Mary, but not quite. It was had a little bit better chance than a Hail Mary.
And that's our show. Our music was provided by Dr. Joe Lombardo, and the audio from the day of the coup was from the New York Now archives. Next week on the podcast, we'll cover the month-long stalemate that followed the coup.
The next day after this, we were in conference and everybody's screaming and what does this mean? And it was like so fucked up.
Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you download podcasts so you never miss an episode. And iPhone listeners should rate and review the podcast, as it helps other people discover the show and might convince my wife to listen. Until next time, podcast adjourned.
It kind of blows my mind that you're doing 7 parts on the coup. This is not World War I. This is not the Civil War. This is not Ken Burns material. I can't get over that you're spending so much audio on this.